So let's talk through every faction in Warhammer 40k, and which miniature releases they might need or want going into 11th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k model releases as we get into the end of 10th edition and a new edition comes around. Games Workshop's 40k release cycles have been fairly predictable with their timescales over the past few years. 8th edition and 9th edition were fairly close mirrors of each other, and 10th edition has been hitting most of the same notes. As a result, we're expecting 40k 11th edition to drop sometime maybe June 2026 or thereabouts, likely meaning around about 8 months to go for 10th edition, which is still plenty of time for lots of new model releases to come out. We do know some of them that are coming, maybe can guess a few others, I'm sure there's plenty more that haven't yet been revealed. In the last few videos about 11th on the channel, I talked about some hopes for the last few months of 10th, some hopes for the rules for 11th, and some ideas and speculation for a 40k launch box for 11th edition, though I'm sure we'll find out more about that nearer the time. For this one I thought we'd focus more on the other factions, maybe not in the launch box, and talk through every single army in the game, some ideas for models that might be most in demand from fans, and in particular talk a bit about the miniatures they've received over the past few editions, as there certainly seem to be some factions that look like they're odds on to get some new stuff in 11th, just literally due to Games Workshop cycles and the ones that need it the most. For model releases in Warhammer 40k, the main focal ones tend to come with codexes, and generally when their time comes around you either get a sort of filler character release, maybe an example being the Death Guard Lord of Poxes for 10th edition. They usually like to give each faction at least some new miniature, whether it's a resculpt of something before or something new, and if they're not going to do a more major kit, then they're often forced to a character miniature, as they're some of the lowest effort ones that they can do, not making enormous changes to a codex, but still gives them something, which is better than it was in the past when certain factions might go multiple editions in a row with literally no releases. Usually it tends to either be that or a more major release wave, say for example what the Tau or the Deathwing or the Blood Angels got in 10th. Really quite a lot more kits. Most of the ones in 10th edition have come out with a launch box set like the one pictured for the Tau, though not literally all of them. The Aeldari and the Votann didn't get one alongside theirs. As a result, whether or not your codex gets a major release in any one edition is quite a big deal. Though sometimes we do get some kind of in-between ones. Necrons had 3 characters with their codex in 10th edition, which was a little more unusual. And there might be miniatures released outside of the usual release cycle, things like Space Marine drop pods, and in particular the Kill Team releases, which can be a good way to focus on a core unit and redo them in a lot of detail with the war gear choices. In any case though, let's go through each faction in the game and start out with the Space Marines. They're always the army that gets the most love, selling super well and having lots of armies dependent on them, so you have lots of appeal for every new miniature that's a generic Space Marine. They get lots of new miniatures every single edition. In 10th edition we've had the Terminators and the big release wave with Indomitus, then a chapter specific character and combat patrol release wave, and we've still got the upcoming Crocs Terminators box set with Assault Terminators and an Ancient, and even beyond that some smaller releases such as a Drop Pod and a Jump Captain. That might be it for 10th, but we really don't know at this point. In 11th though, there's no chance that's going to be slowing down at all. Space Marines are always in Games Workshop's launch box unless they decide to really surprise us. They're pretty much the title faction, and that means they'll get a lot of miniatures either resculpted or updated, or entirely new things added in. In particular, at the start of 11th edition, I think it's probably general expectation at this point that the remaining Firstborn kits are going to face a reckoning, either being updated to Primaris or being removed from the rules at least for now. As mentioned, they're likely to get a whole release wave in the launch box. I did the entire last video on that one, just talking through some previous patterns they'd had and things that they might choose to do with a new one. On the Marine side, it usually tends to be character heavy and having at least a bit of an emphasis on entirely new stuff that no one's had before, and then having a follow-up release wave alongside a codex early in the edition where you both get new miniatures but also multi-part versions of the things in the launch box. Space Marines are an enormous range with a huge amount of history, so despite having more models than any other faction, there's still masses of stuff they could either redo or add in new. For resculpts of Firstborn things, the really obvious ones are Vanguard veterans at this point. If they don't have a release for those within the year, I will be very surprised, and otherwise I suspect we're going to get the Land Raider redone drop pod style. Beyond that though, there's going to be a reckoning for several other Firstborn things, depending on whether they decide to keep the base vehicles and just redo them, or update them to hover tanks like the Gladiator, things like the Whirlwind and Vindicator there. The same for the Rhino and Predator tanks. Tactical Marines and Devastators, we're going to have to see whether or not they are entirely being replaced by Intercessors and Desolation squads, or we're going to have both. And there's other things that have gone away in the past that seem ripe for inspiration for Primaris releases. Venerable or Ironclad Dreadnoughts would both be nice at Primaris Redemptor scale, and we might get new versions of the Landspeeder Storm or Scout bikes. Then that's before we get into any new creativity they decide to do. For Primaris releases, you could do some multi-part kits for the Suppressors or the Outriders, or some individual releases for things like the Genestealer, which are locked to launch box brews at the moment. If they felt like some really big Space Marine releases, they could release the Overlord gunship, a big flyer that's been teased in the lore that the Primaris use, but we haven't seen representation on the tabletop yet, presuming they're not doing the meme of some sort of plastic Thunderhawk, of course. They could do a Primaris super heavy tank, maybe like the Astrius, or resculpting that in plastic. And then there's all sorts of Primaris Marines that you could do with various weapon loadouts, maybe a Grav squad, seeing as we've had Flamers, Melters and Plasma. There's been artwork of Chainsword and Shield Primaris that could be another reasonable one. You could do a squad managed on jet bikes, maybe a veteran biker squad similar to Sabodin Khan, or you could add an actual squad to say the Imperial Fist and Salamanders and those core Codex chapters to give them a little bit more of a sort of mini Codex feel. Then there's about a million possible generic characters, filling in the gaps that we don't have for things like Jump Librarians, Gravis Lieutenants, Bike Captains, or Terminator Apothecaries. You could do a generic Chapter Master model, and I feel like maybe this Jump Chaplain that the Blood Angels had could perhaps be a higher chance than most to get an update, given that they're still present in the rules. There's then all the named characters, where they've got plenty of inspiration. We've just had a wave of those, but Pedro Cantor seems to have been left out. He still has rules when plenty of ones were taken away, so maybe more chance than most. There's plenty of other things that were there in the past they could redo though. Tyberos the Red Wake will be a fun one to see from previous Forge World books. Maybe Gabriel Angelos redone for the Blood Ravens, or yet more Ultramarine characters such as Sergeant Talion. Finally, with characters, there's always the possibility for Primarchs to return. I guess it's still going to be that they'll do Lehman Russ first, given that he's got an entire range to his name. But then after that, the other loyalist ones are fair game. Vulcan, Corvus Corax, Rogel Dawn and Jagatai Khan, all basically lost in the lore and not confirmed dead. And if and when they do return, it could be a catalyst for a few associated chapter releases alongside if they wanted to. I guess for Primarchs we'll at least continue to get one per edition if not more. We had the line in an end edition campaign. If we do similar for Russ, maybe we might get one or even a pair of them turn up for 11th one. Overall, Space Marines have got a massive amount of options. I'm sure we're going to get a fair chunk of things redone at the start, and I'm sure plenty of that will be previous Firstborn stuff converted to Primaris in one way or another. Many seem a case of when not if. I'm sure they'll dream up some other flavours of characters and other units to sell us to. Before we move on to the other Imperial armies, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titans Terrain. They're one option for some easy to store and transport battlefield terrain to play Warhammer 40k on. They'll do things really quite different to most out there with their folding pop-up cardboard terrain system. The idea behind their stuff is that you make a battlefield out of a 3x4 grid to make a 45x60 inch board, the right size for 10th edition 40k, and then each one of those cardboard tiles unfolds and up pops a building. So you basically have an entire battlefield that can fold down and store flat, fitting in the box set the same size as say a normal sized board game. For that reason it means that storage and transport is probably the biggest USP of this one. Very nice if you need to take it around to a friend's house or you don't have much space to store a bulky terrain set at home. They've got a few different flavours and looks of it on offer, and like just about every third party terrain set it is cheaper than Games Workshop stuff. There are a few trade-offs for it and it might not be right for everyone. I'll talk through a few pros and cons at the end of the video for those who want to cycle back there. But in any case, there'll be links down in the video description below, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, with the enormous Space Marine possibilities out the way, we've got the Astra Militarum. In recent editions, we saw 9th edition have really quite a big Cadian refresh, getting lots of resculpts for their classic stuff, plus the mighty Rogel Dawn battle tank and Lord Solar Leontus entering the fray. And then 10th edition had the big and popular launch of the Death Corps of Krieg range, lots of gas mask regiment guardsmen attacking the enemy and siege regiments. They've done fairly well for kill teams as well, in 10th edition getting the Aquilons and the Rattlings. In 11th edition, as a result, it feels a bit less guaranteed they're going to get a third major release wave in a row, unless Games Workshop have planned it all from the start, and maybe there was some sort of grand plan to do Cadians the first year, Death Corps next edition, and then Cast Chance the one after. I do suspect they'll eventually get a range release, though otherwise at this point I might have half expected Games Workshop to just retire those plastic kits. If they do get a major release wave, I'd say it's probably odds on to be that, redoing their core infantry squad, heavy weapon teams, and command squad all at once. Their regular infantry are one of 40k's kits that hold up least well now and look pretty dated decades ago, and could be a nice opportunity to return Strachan and Harker to the range and update Marbo to plastic as he's still resin. Otherwise, for wider guard possibilities, there's often a fair few queries as to why they don't have a biker unit. Feels like it'd fit in pretty well with the 20th century army vibe that they have going, or maybe they could reacquire their Taurus Venator back. It was previously one of their Forge World kits, but seems to have moved over to Necromunda. It feels like Cast Chans almost have to be the next major regiment that they do, presuming that they keep on doing them, but they did used to have masses of different options in their metal range. They could redo the Vostroyans, Mordians, Valhallans or Talon. It was maybe a little bit interesting that the Red Gobbo's Timboy thing seems to be vaguely Vostroyan in style. Who knows if that could be a not so subtle hint or not. Commissar Yarrick is maybe one of the most fan requested miniatures as well. Maybe if there's Orks as the primary antagonist in 11th edition, it could be a bit more likely. And if GW wanted to expand the infantry, you could maybe do so with either conscripts, veterans, special weapon squads, or Weird Vein Psychers. There could be a little bit less guarantees to get any of those, given that you'd have to pick and choose which regimental aesthetic that they release them for. Beyond that, more longer term, they could dig into the huge back catalogue of Forge World things that they have retired, things like the Hades Breaching Drill, converting the Resin Cyclops Demolition Vehicle to plastic, or remaking a few more of the Krieg options. You could have things like a Death Rider generic character, or their Mars Alpha Russ. They've got more than enough to keep them going if they want to. Out of these ones, if I had to guess, maybe Kaschans or Yarrick might be some of the more likely ones, and it also feels sort of like the Kaschan Jungle Fighters will be made to be a kill team kit. Would be cool to see a rendition of them in that kind of style. Next up, for the Cog Boys of the Adeptus Mechanicus, they're at least a relatively recent range in Warhammer 40k terms. 8th edition had a medium-sized release wave for them. That's when they got their Archaeopter and the Scorpius Disintegrator, but since then they've not really had too much love at all. Just the Skitarii Marshal in 9th edition, the Sidonian Scatros in 10th edition, and then their Kill Team Servitor Battleclade. Despite having a couple of editions on the down low, I don't think they're going to be particularly likely to get a major update in 11th, though obviously who really knows. They just seem like a fairly small and well executed faction, but they do have a fairly solid amount of unit options in their range, and feels like Games Workshop's motivation to release more for them might be a little bit on the low side, particularly when they don't have a massive bloated HQ section so they can keep on shoving in some more characters. Obviously it'd be all very cool if they did get a release wave, and they do have lots of solid possibilities as well. I feel like the major one that's always the talking point is if they could convert some of the Heresy era Automata to the 40k players. It feels like AdMech basically got left out of that sort of by bad luck and timing. The Custodians and Knights got their rules ported across, but the AdMech missed out on the Forge World Black Book that would have done the same for their stuff, and therefore all those fancy Heresy Automata don't even have Legends rules in Warhammer 40k. In particular, it seems to be on the wish list for AdMech players to get more classes of Robot and Automata, things to go alongside the Castellan robots. In 30k you've got plenty of specifications like their Thanatar ones, Castellax, or their Stratos hovering ones. For other possibilities you could do their Titan Guard units in plastic, maybe some sort of big self-propelled gun thing like the Ordinatus. It wouldn't necessarily have to be quite that big, but could be more sort of mid-size. Getting a Terrax transport drill in plastic would be kind of fun. And we did get a few bits of fun artwork recently with AdMech going mining for Blackstone, a great big mining beam laser, and a tech priest that looked like he had some mining gear. It's probably just some fun lore and artwork, but I'm sure people wouldn't be complaining too much if they were heralding new miniatures. Plenty of these will be fun. I can't help but think though that we're more likely just to get another obscure designation of Tech Priest, though I guess we'll wait and see. Next up, for the Adeptus Sorortias, they are not in too different a spot. A pretty recently done and nicely executed range. 8th edition brought them back in a vengeance after there being a metal range for a very long time. 9th edition doubled down with another release wave as a follow-up, and 10th has been a little bit more on the down low, with a Jump Caroness, a special release for Celestian Sacrosanct Avalyn, and the Sanctifiers kill team. We know there's one more kill team coming fairly soon though. In 11th edition, I'd kind of guess they'd be unlikely to have another major release wave, perhaps in a similar sort of position to the AdMech. Maybe the big difference between their ranges is they really don't need any more minor character support. The Sisters range has a vast amount of those already. I guess for new models, we do know that we're getting the Kill Team Celestian Insidians. They're an anti-psyker specialist kill team that will be coming out in 2026. Some similar kind of vibes to the Celestian Sacrosancts with some big flowing robes and then null maces to take down enemy witches. I feel like they maybe don't have quite so many super obvious things to add in compared with some. From the removed units from the Ministorum point of view, they could do Death Cult Assassins or Crusaders, both of which might be done in a similar sort of style to the Arco-Flagellants. I feel like the Crusaders would be the exact sort of Imperial weirdness that would work rather well as a kill team release. We did see a Death Cult Assassin in the Sanctifier set too. It's kind of surprising that now we've got two designations of Celestians, but no standard one with bolters as they used to be in the past. For some common 40k tropes, maybe you could have a mounted biker unit, or perhaps some sort of sniper or assassin units to take down some enemy witches from afar. Otherwise for Forge World you could redo their Oppressor in plastic. That was a Forge World rather crowd control style vehicle, though realistically I can't really see them doing yet another transport when they already have the Rhino and the Immolator. I feel like just about anything other than yet another character release would probably be preferable. Maybe if they did do another character, perhaps it might be a generic Paragon Warsuit leader. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Custodes, who are maybe in a bit more of a curious place compared with most factions. 8th edition has their launch as a primary 40k faction with a wave of kits in plastic coming out there. And then for their mainline 40k things, in 9th edition they just had their Blade Champion, and 10th edition the Solo Shield Captain kit. Their status in 40k is a weird one, as half of their range is in Forge World resin, and their models kind of equally apply to the Horus Heresy as they do to modern 40k, or at least for the most part. Games Workshop's been sending most Forge World models into Legends for 40k over the past edition, though the Knights and Custodians have had a pass at least for now, though it's certainly not certain exactly how they're going to be treated going on from here. Games Workshop have basically confirmed that the Horus Heresy are going to be getting a bunch of Custodes updates, but given it is releases for Horus Heresy, it'll be packaged for them and aimed at them. So how much spills over to Warhammer 40k is maybe a bit more of a question, whether they keep their ongoing Imperial armor kind of status, or get kits sent to Legends like Contemptors and Leviathans for the core Space Marines. However, it does fall out if there was a way for the Custodes to get their Forge World range just directly converted into plastic and playable in Warhammer 40k. I'm sure that'll make a good number of collectors happy. It is weird having Custodes being one of the cheaper armies to collect, and then having the other half of the army be prohibitively expensive, particularly when that half has a bunch of cool stuff like their big golden dreadnoughts. Beyond that, there's lots of stuff in the Forge World range though, their gun tank in the Caladius, jump infantry in the Venatari, their generic dedicated transport vehicle besides the Land Raider, plus ranged Custodes in the Sagittarian ones. I do strongly suspect that literally all of these will get a plastic port for the Horus Heresy in the sometime nearer or later. We absolutely do know that they're going to be getting a Horus Heresy release at least fairly soon. Games Workshop teased a plastic Guardian Spear when the Heresy edition came out. Though I'd guess they won't do all of them all at once, probably something like half the range as they did with the Mechanicum and the Auxilia. Beyond that, there is the other Talon of the Emperor as well. They could expand the Sisters of Silence. It would be kind of cool if they had a few more options for Warhammer 40k, and they have had rules for a few other wargear options in Heresy that could light the way a bit. They've had jet bike riding units described, firing anti-Drathic weapons or needle cannons, various different Sisters with other specialist weapons, heavy flamers or combi weapons, and also their unique transport, the Charon Pattern Inquisitor, which for some reason, unlike the Custodes main Horus Heresy line, never had rules for Warhammer 40k. Definitely a lot of ways they could go if they wanted to expand the other Talon of the Emperor. In any case, seems like we might be getting some answers for the Adeptus Custodes in the not too distant future. For the Grey Knights, hopefully they should be odds on for updates in 11th edition. There were lots of people hoping that they would get their range refresh in 10th, but it seems that it's been pushed back. And now at this point, I'd be very surprised if they don't get their major overhaul in 11th. They're the last of the Loyalist Space Marines to get a Primaris scaling update. They've really not had many models recently. 8th edition had nothing for them, and 7th only Voldus. 9th had Castell and Crow. And then 10th edition had their Dread Knight upgrade sprue, which wasn't exactly popular as they didn't even get an entire new model for it. We're seeing how Games Workshop chooses to overhaul Space Marines these days. Some past precedents from Dark Angels, Blood Angels and Space Wolves. I think we can expect something pretty similar for the Grey Knights. For their miniatures, their needs and kits are fairly obvious. Castell and Crow's miniature basically showed us that they were happy to have an upscaled firstborn aesthetic marine, not necessarily having to make them look Primaris or anything like that, and just have them bigger. So as a result, they need some new Terminators, boosted scale on their power armoured variants, and then a good number of character refreshes as well, Caldor Drago being maybe one of the biggest and most desired one, perhaps Captain Stern, but certainly some generic leaders both in Terminator and power armour. It is kind of sad that the Grey Knights don't have a single generic sculpted HQ choice right now, either just borrowing the even more generic ones from the Space Marines, or expected to convert them out of other kits. I'm not sure whether the Dread Knight will get an update at the same time. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't be against Games Workshop having another go at that particular miniature. It might be a little bit less likely now that it's just had an upgrade sprue, but who really knows again there? They have had times where they've added an upgrade sprue to something and then just immediately redone the kit shortly after. That's what happened with the Cadian Shock Troops. Overall, unless Games Workshop's being exceptionally mean to them, they seem odds on for a major refresh. Next up, we've got the Imperial Knights. Over their last few editions, in 8th edition we had the Armigers box set and the Dominus Knights plus Canis Rex expanded from the main one. That really took them from a one-kit faction into a bit more of a mini-army, even if it's still an unusual one. In 9th edition, they unusually had literally no core 40k kits released, just about every other faction got something. In 10th edition, they had their Knight Defender upgrade sprue, with parallel releases for the 3 Sarastus Knights in plastic from their Imperial Armour document, though with packaging related to the Horus Heresy setting, and they're primarily products from that range. For a new edition for the Knights, I'd be kind of surprised if they have any sort of enormous release wave with multiple kits. They seem like the sort of faction that adding in any new Knight variant or any upgrade in general is going to be quite a big deal. I don't think people will be hugely surprised if they just got one semi-major thing per edition, though if it's a big and interesting one then so much the better. For ways to go for the Knight range, it's basically going to be big stompy things with different flavours of wargear and maybe different sizes. There's the obvious parallel release wave for the Horus Heresy and Imperial Armour, with the Forge World Knights gradually being made plastic. They've still got the Atropos, Moirax, Megara Styrex and Acastus to go, and in some of the books for the Horus Heresy they've also mentioned an Chaos class knight a couple of times, which could be a hint of things to come in the future. Again, like the Custodes, it would be very helpful if they actually decided to fully include them in a codex to save uncertainty as to whether or not they're going to send them to Legends at some point. Otherwise, there's plenty of possibility for other knight classes, maybe a Psyker class knight like the Chaos have with the Abominant. Though given that we've had it literally teased in the lore, they've mentioned a Tricholos class knight, which is apparently a siege knight, described as bullish and probably going to be hitting the enemy at close range with some very heavy guns. It could be somewhat similar to the classic version of the Knight Warden from Epic. Otherwise, you could expand the Armigers kit in a bunch of different ways. The Chaos Knight's core kit builds 3 and they can field 2 others. The Imperial ones can only field 2 variants currently. You could add in a chain cannon as an armament option similar to the War Dogs, or perhaps do something more unusual like a shield bearing one, or maybe even something weirder like a jump armiger. Then finally getting down to the smaller scale, I do wonder whether or not they'll ever do a sort of feudal 40k men-at-arms style thing, likely bannermen and grunts for the Imperial Knights to follow along behind, and maybe stand on some objectives and things so they don't need to ally in Imperial Agents to do that. Could be a nice way to make them interact with more normal 40k just that little bit more without having to go out of codex. Overall feels like maybe that Tricholos Knight is the single biggest hint that we might have had. That doesn't sound like something that was printed by accident in the recent codex, and I suspect that we'll see that turn up in some form or another that might not be exactly what we expect. For the Imperial Agents, they're one of the armies that's kind of barely a faction for Warhammer 40k right now. They represent a class of models that Games Workshop sort of interpreted and reinterpreted one edition after another, though maybe they might be lucky enough to stay in a codex with the same name one edition to the next from 10th to 11th. They have had quite a lot of relevant releases over the past few editions. Several kill teams have fallen to them, with the RBTs, the Navy Breachers, the Inquisitorial Agents, and then the Sanctifiers. And then they've had 5 different Inquisitor releases, 2 of them being some limited edition ones with Mr. Cartavolnus here, and Inquisitor Ostromandius from Warhammer Plus. On top of that, they're able to field their borrowed units from the Deathwatch and the Sisters. For 11th releases, they often seem to get something throughout an edition, though not necessarily trying to cater to them as a proper army to fight on their own right. More sort of cool stuff that's out there in the Warhammer 40k backstory, and not necessarily to try and advance them as a faction in their own right. There's no reason they couldn't go for that if they wanted to shift around. It just seemed kind of weird that they seem to be going for that when they released the codex, and then just haven't really decided to treat them like a normal army for balance purposes, which doesn't really give you loads of hope on that front. For some options for future releases though, there's a few really obvious Inquisitors that they could redo, each of which would be a big deal in its own right. There's Inquisitor Karamazov on his stompy Throne of Judgment, Inquisitor Eisenhorn, who's still got a miniature on sale but in resin. He's certainly got the lore and plenty of fan appeal to back him up, and for some reason they're still missing just a generic Inquisitor kit for the range. They could re-release Mr. Erasmus Cartavolnus to fill that gap if they wanted to, or make something new and multi-part. I'd kind of hope they might wind up doing that at some point. They did keep the rules around despite having no official model for it, though it would be very weird for the Codex Imperial Agents to have no Inquisitor choice to ally, and only have the named ones on offer. Beyond that, the 40k galaxy is a big place, and there's lots of weirdness out there that's probably going to find its home better in Agents compared with elsewhere. If they did want to give a more of a core fighting force to the Agents themselves, maybe some Inquisitorial Stormtroopers would be a good idea. Failing that, just allowing them to field Tempestus Scions would also seem reasonable enough. They could redo the Joe Cairo or the Demon Host or both, perhaps as part of a wider kill team or retinue. If Legion of the Damned ever showed up again, then I guess they'd probably be here. And finally, if they did want them to credibly stand on their own 2 feet as an extra army, they would probably need some serious anti-tank. No idea what they go for that. Maybe some sort of big gun mounted on a Rhino or Chimera chassis. Overall, I'd probably be most hopeful for one of Karamazov, Eisenhorn, or the Inquisitor, and maybe the odd kill team release. Finally, for the Imperium, we've got the Divergent Chapter Space Marines. For the Black Templars, they had their major 9th edition release wave with their new range redone in Primaris form, and then in 10th edition had 2 characters in the Execrated Chaplain and the Ancient. In light of that and being fairly completist about their releases, I feel like in 11th we're very unlikely to get any sort of major release wave for them, though it would be nice if they did get a small release, maybe for it not to be a character. They already maybe seem a little bit, perhaps surprisingly character heavy, and it doesn't seem that they were particularly keen to save characters to string out their release wave, as they chose to release 2 of them in 10th edition when they could have done them one by one. It does feel a bit less obvious what they might do for the Black Templars now. I felt like a banner bearer and a Templar-specific chaplain were two of the more obvious character releases that they might go down. When I asked Black Templar players what they'd like to see, maybe the two most common answers would be a Templar-specific Dreadnought, maybe even a chaplain one like Forge World did previously. That's be fairly on brand for them, or as an alternative maybe some Sword Brethren style Terminators, which I'm sure would look pretty epic if they did somewhat similar to the Deathwing Knights. I feel like just about every Space Marine chapter would happily welcome a unique Terminator squad variant, and the Templars are no exception. If they did do a Terminator squad for them, it should also open the door for doing something like a Terminator Marshal for them. In any case, hopefully they come up with something interesting. Next up, we've got the Blood Angels, and they, the Dark Angels, and the Space Wolves have been in a similar sort of pattern of updates in the Primaris era, getting a single character, a lieutenant, and an upgrade sprue from 8th edition, then one major character in 9th, and then in 10th edition having a more major release wave. For the Blood Angels, it was Mephiston, then Dante, and then the release wave with a bunch of characters, and then the new and less well-received Sanguinary Guard. It does feel like all three of these chapters have maybe had partial release waves that leave the door open for more coming next edition. For the Blood Angels in particular, it was notable that they have no Death Company models at the moment, just regular Primaris painted black, and given they were happy to do different models for things like Blood Claws and Grey Hunters for the Space Wolves, I just can't imagine that they seriously plan to keep the Blood Angels without actual Death Company miniatures long term. They only really have two main squads that differ significantly from the rest of the Codex, and Death Company are one of them. As a result, if I had to gamble, I'd certainly expect that Death Company will turn up for 11th edition. It might be slightly interesting to see exactly what form that they take though. They've previously been able to be taken both at jump packs and on foot. I suspect jump pack versions would probably get priority over any on foot ones, particularly given that they've got their chaplains with jump packs to lead them, though if they were feeling generous they might be able to do squads of both. Otherwise, for other most obvious ones, they could return some of the removed units to the Codex, maybe a Librarian Dreadnought or a more dedicated actual modelled Death Company Dreadnought. They could do more Sanguinary Priest with a jump pack one there, or maybe resurrect Brother Corbulo as a named character that went away. Both of those maybe seem perhaps a little less likely though. What happens to the Baal Predator is going to depend on what happens to the regular Predator. If it stays, they might get an update. If it goes away, then maybe we'll get some sort of Baal Gladiator pattern. And we have had their unique Terminator Assault Squad retire with the announcement of their new ones. Terminators maybe aren't the first thing that you think when you think Blood Angels, but as with the Black Templars, I'm sure they wouldn't pass up some fun themed ones. It'd maybe be more likely to be a generic Space Marine release, but having a standard jump chaplain wouldn't be the worst thing in the world either. We've only got the Firstborn model one, which is the Blood Angels one and is really quite nice, and having some Blood Angels Death Company releases could be a bit of motivation for that. It'd likely be more of a wish list than something that's actually going to happen, though I'm sure at least some people wouldn't be averse to them taking back the Sanguinary Guard and trying again. Next up for their counterpart Angels of Death, we've got the Dark Angels. For their releases in 8th edition they had Lazarus, then in 9th they had Azrael and the glorious return of the Lion. And then he was followed up fairly shortly after by the 10th edition release wave for them, the Deathwing release including their Deathwing Knights, Chaplain Asmodai, and their Totally Not Fallen Inner Circle companions. I feel like from the pattern of that release though, they feel more obvious than just about any of the other chapters, that they should be odds on for an 11th edition follow-up wave, just as they've quite clearly done about half the job that they need to for the Dark Angels. We had the Deathwing release for 10th edition, and given they seem to be phasing out Firstborn as fast as they can across all the different armies, it'd mean that 11th edition has good odds to be a Ravenwing release wave. As to what that might look like, Samael would be a no-brainer on his jet bike, and also absolutely guaranteed would be some Ravenwing Black Knights. It'd be fun to see those Outrider style, though I do suspect it could go hand in hand with them losing the option to be fielded as a command squad as with the Deathwing Knights. Otherwise I guess they might give them something to stand instead of the Landspeeder Vengeance or the Dark Shroud, maybe an updated version of that Stormspeeder style. For the planes that maybe be a little bit less hopeful about them sticking around, they chose to remove the Space Wolf, Stormwolf and Stormfang aircraft, and despite them being really quite fun and popular kits, I could easily see them doing the same for the Ravenwing ones. Beyond that, Ezekiel seems basically guaranteed to turn up at some point as well, maybe alongside that next wave in the same way that Asmodai was. He's the only miniature that survived in metal, and he would have been retired long ago if Games Workshop didn't want to do a new version of him. And then finally I'd guess that we might get some sort of generic Dark Angels character which hasn't turned up yet. We've had generic ones for the Space Wolves and Blood Angels, but none for the Unforgiven. For me, the most obvious choices will be a standard Company Master or an Interrogator Chaplain, both of which will be significantly different enough to the standard versions of that to warrant a sculpt. Overall, feels like Dark Angels have got better odds of getting fun stuff in the next edition than most, and plenty of obvious choices for Games Workshop to redo. Then we've got their rivals, the Space Wolves. Again, they've had sort of muted things over the past couple of editions, but then their big release wave in 10th a bigger and more generous one than the Dark Angels or Blood Angels got, at least in terms of mainline infantry kits, and they've got a fairly similar amount of characters. Like the other two, despite having really quite a big release wave, there's plenty of kits they haven't got around to redoing yet, and kind of depends on just how eager they are to phase out the remaining Firstborn, or whether they really want to replace them before they're happy to remove things like the Thunderwolf Cavalry. I'm not sure if Games Workshop's going by all of these with the same playbook, or they've decided to focus just a massive amount of Space Wolf releases all in one go. Perhaps with an extra generous release wave there's less chance that they get more stuff in 11th, but it still feels that there's plenty of other things that they could do for them. We do of course know there's one more thing coming for them in 10th edition, and we've got the Wolf Scouts. They've got a kill team release with a bunch of dual build ones, plus a pet friend Viridian Wolf. They'll be in the kill team set fighting against the stealth suits. Despite having a lot of updates, once again there's plenty of Space Wolf things that didn't get redone, maybe Bjorn the Fell-Handed being one of the single most obvious. Given that Games Workshop had done a bit of social media promotion and featured him kind of prominently a few times, I was kind of more surprised he didn't turn up for 10th edition. And again, I'd say he feels like one of the more odds-on ones to get a resculpt. Otherwise, the Thunderwolves are Firstborn, so potentially them and perhaps a leader to lead them. Or the Slayer's the last Firstborn character in the Codex. Aside from the generic Iron Priest, they could do a generic Rune Priest as well if they wanted to complete the set. And if they've redone everything else, it feels like they might well go for Wolfen as well. They are a bit of a lesser loved kit that it will be kind of cool to see a new take on. The really big question mark is Leman Russ himself though. I'm still largely suspecting he might well turn up for a 10th edition end campaign in a similar sort of style to Lionel Johnson. It'd work rather well there, and perhaps just as importantly, it'd work really well from a Games Workshop sales point of view, given they've got a whole bunch of people interested in the Space Wolves with their big new range, and then they can have a bit of synergy and build excitement for the faction between that and the Primarch. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the Deathwatch. They've certainly got to be in the running for one of 40k's most neglected factions in the Primaris era. They had their release as a mini-faction in 7th edition with Deathwatch Overkill, and then their 4 main plastic kits. Perhaps not with the best timing in the world, as that happened just before the dawn of the Primaris Space Marines, so they were some of the last Firstborn kits to come out. Then since then they've been left high and dry and not given any token character support like the Blood Angels, Space Wolves or Dark Angels, so no real new miniatures for them at all until their 10th edition release when they've had this new Veterans kit recently coming out in Kill Team Tomb World. It's perhaps not really looking enormously hopeful for them given that Games Workshop had previously done codexes for them and then deciding that they weren't worth bothering with for 10th edition, instead deciding to try and roll them in to Imperial Agents, which people really didn't take so well. Then it seems they chose to backpedal on that, giving them some digital index support, perhaps due to their prominence in Space Marine 2 and a few other interesting animation things. As a result, their future seems more uncertain than the vast majority of 40k factions out there. Really feels like they could go one of two ways with them, continue to keep them niche, or maybe treat their kill team kit as a bit of a forerunner as we've often had with some range releases, like the Kroot Farstalkers and then the big Kroot range, or the Deathcore of Krieg kill team and then the full release wave for them. For the Deathwatch, basically Games Workshop need to decide what they do about them and then how much support they'll get. I guess if you were trying to make the rest of the range Primaris, it'd be the Watchmaster and Captain Artemis to get some Primaris scaling updates, and beyond that if they actually wanted to try and build more of a range for them, they could have some scope for creativity. They use fancy Imperial tech that isn't used in other places quite so much. They could do entire kill teams in the different Primaris armor classes, though it seems kind of unlikely to me. Or they could add in some other specialist transport vehicles to deliver their kill teams from A to B, maybe a version of the Impulsor or something. The Corvus Blackstar seems fine enough to stay, provided they don't decide to cust out like the Space Wolf flyer. It's just a shame that Games Workshop don't really seem to be keen on supporting flyers or aircraft particularly well in 10th edition, given that one of their 4 kits in plastic at the moment is one of those. Overall, it would be nice to get a token character release if nothing else, and they certainly could do more. We'll see what happens with their digital index status when it comes to 11th though. Moving on to the Loyalists, let's talk through the Forces of Chaos and start out with the Chaos Marines and their Deity Legions. The Chaos Space Marines are a big and popular faction and they've been doing fairly well for releases in recent times. 8th edition had a fairly major release wave for them alongside Abaddon, 9th edition had another one alongside the Chosen Accursed Cultists, and then a Demon Prince after that, and 10th edition hasn't been quite so big, but they've had 2 generic Chaos Lords, the Night Lords upgrade sprue, and also an upcoming kill team kit as well. They have had the majority of their range redone at this point, though I still wouldn't count them out for a more major release wave in 11th once again. They are a very popular faction, and there's still plenty of things they could do for them. For 10th edition, we will be getting the new sculpts of the Raptors and Warp Talons. They'll first be available in this Murder Wing kill team. That's coming out in 2026 alongside the Celestian Insidiants. Looking through their massive range beyond that though, and they have an absolute ton of stuff, The absolute most obvious choice are the Chaos Bikers, which I'm really quite surprised didn't get an update last time around. They were on a big list of rumours alongside a whole bunch of other stuff that came true. I'm sure they'll look nice redone at sort of Outrider scale. Otherwise, they could revisit Mutilators if they want to, or make a multi-part Obliterator kit, maybe as part of the same thing. The Exalted Champion, in a sort of Chaos Lieutenant sort of style, was here for a bit and then went away. Here on Blackheart, I'm pretty certain we'll be getting a release. He is a big deal in the lore and feels like an absolute prime target for a single character release, maybe in an end edition campaign if Games Workshop fancied it. The Hellbrute's another potential. I feel like they'd want him being a similar sort of size and stature to his Lawless Redemptor counterpart. And while I've got plenty of older tanks and vehicles that might get redone depending on what they do with the Lawless Land Raider and Predators, the Defiler's probably worth a mention as well, being one that's maybe showing its age a bit more than most, I'd say. Terminators could potentially be another possibility too. I guess they wouldn't get redone for at least some time though, given that they only came out in 8th edition. Again, maybe slightly unfortunate timing for those ones, getting a nice Terminator update, but not so very long before they upped the scale for the Loyalist ones in 10th. Then besides generic Chaos stuff, there's a lot of Chaos Legion things that they could do. It does seem a bit unfair for Games Workshop to give each of the first founding legions on the Loyalist side not 1 but 2 characters at this point, when the ones on the Chaos side don't have any for 40k, but on the other hand it would be very easy to imagine them doing a similar sort of release wave and 1 character for each of these sub-factions, maybe an Iron Warrior, Alpha Legion, Word Bearer and Night Lord one, and might be a good excuse to revisit their rules. If they were feeling generous, it would be quite nice to have a similar sort of release with an upgrade sprue like the Night Lords. That did a remarkably good job for an upgrade sprue of capturing the feel of the Legion. It might or might not be an actual teaser, but there's maybe a good chance that the Alpha Legion are going to get something, given that we have this rumour engine of a Pale Spear of theirs. It could equally be for the Horus Heresy though, or a limited edition Black Library miniature. Like the Loyalists, their legions have several Primarchs that they could redo whenever they feel like it. Lorgar and Perturabo are both active in the 41st millennium. I'm sure they will turn up, and feels like there's a pretty good chance that one of those guys will get a miniature in 11th edition if they do keep the Primarchs rolling out on schedule. Alfarius could be perfectly possible as well, even if he's rumoured to be dead. Finally, while talking legions, probably worth mentioning the Fallen as well. You could make quite a nice kill team kit for them as a sort of veteran option. And if they wanted to release Luthor, it could be quite a fun one as another major big bad out there in the current Warhammer 40k setting. I'd guess he'd be likely to be folded into the Chaos Space Marines if anywhere. I can't seriously see Games Workshop making Fallen Dark Angels into their own faction. Overall, for things that I'd expect to see, I'd expect Huron Blackheart and the Chaos Bikers to be some of the highest odds ones, and hopefully they will eventually get around to doing a sort of mini character release for the individual Chaos Legions in a similar style to the Loyalist. It just seems silly for legions like the Iron Warriors and Alpha Legion to have no official model representation in the 40k setting, even if they have lots in Heresy. Moving on to the Deity Legions though, the Death Guard were the antagonist faction of 8th edition, so had an enormous amount of kits come out there compared with the rest, and then sort of filler follow-up releases in 9th and 10th, with the Lord of Virulence and Miasmic Malignifier, and then in 10th edition having the Lord of Poxes. Despite having a couple of editions on the down low, I still guess they're probably going to be less likely to get a major release wave, just given that they've still got so much more stuff overall than any of their 3 fellow Deity Legions. If they did do releases for them, again they're a legion that don't really need any more support characters, they've got loads of them. Maybe the one exception could be for the Lord of Contagion. I think people really wouldn't be too averse to having one that looks like the Dark Imperium one come back, given that the Lord's Felthius sculpt is a bit of a divisive one. To bulk out the army with a few more choices, it would be quite cool to see another Plague Marine equivalent maybe as one of the coolest things. Having a Havoc version of them that could take down some vehicles would be quite nice, or maybe some ones with breacher shields. If they wanted to add in an extra sprue as well, maybe they could expand the main box set up to a set of 10, perhaps adding in one more sprue to the box to round out the numbers a bit. Otherwise, Death Guard had Possessed and now they don't. Maybe another Elite Infantry kit is a bit less likely to materialise, but would be cool to see a take on those. I guess it'd probably be a 3-model Elite one similar to the 8-bound or the Flawless Blades. I'm sure people would enjoy a new Hellbrute, as with the rest of the Deity Legions, and I guess for another character idea, you could do a Sorcerer in Terminator armour, as that was another one that they have no Death Guard model for. As mentioned though, I'd be kind of surprised if they get anything too generous for 11th. For the World Eaters, they got Khan the Betrayer as a precursor in 8th edition, then a full faction release wave at the end of 9th, maybe not quite as big a one as people might have been hoping though, with Angron, Berserkers, 8-bound, a couple of characters and cultists. Quite a few people were hoping for a follow-up release wave in 10th edition, but instead they got a filler character release with the Slaughterbound as a big 8-bound, And then the Goremongers Kill Team kit, where I feel like another flavour of Jackal Cultist would have probably been towards the bottom of people's priorities. I feel like there's a pretty reasonable chance they just get yet another filler character release for next edition, though I'm sure if anything more than that materialised, people will be really quite happy. There's quite a few obvious fan requests that people were kind of expecting to come out either with the Codex last time or this time around that just didn't happen. For some of those, I'm particularly looking to the Death Guard as the way to do things. The Red Butcher's unique Terminators, I'm sure, will be well enjoyed. They have Terminators in the Codex, but could easily have themed ones. Given they have a Lord on Juggernaut, Berserkers on Juggernaut Cavalry could be a fun one. They do look like they've got teased in art around the previous Codex release. Though failing on that, World Eaters Bikers or just using generic Chaos Marine Bikers wouldn't be the worst thing in the world either, being one of the many things that got cut from their range in the jump out of Core Codex Space Marines. For the single most likely thing to turn up for them, I'm absolutely certain we'll be getting a Berserker miniature for them at some point. This one was heavily teased in lore when their first codex came out. The guy who maintains the nails and helps make the 8-bound, he seems kind of perfect for a small character release, and if 11th edition does turn out to be just that, I'd guess it will be him. And then finally, once again, looking to Death Guard and Forge World as inspiration. There's quite a notable absence of Cornate Demon engines that just have the towering Lord of Skulls. It'd be nice to see something like a Blood Slaughterer or maybe a small Brass Scorpion, adding a bit more theme than the more generic Core Codex Space Marine ones do. There's definitely lots of good wishlist ones for the World Eaters, though less obvious which will actually turn up. For the Thousand Sons, they're an army that had a big release wave in 7th edition, getting Magnus and their core range, though since then support has been limited. Maybe there were a few mixed feelings about the Zangors and the Mutalith Vortex Beast coming in. Fair enough, Tzeentchian miniatures, though they were ported from Age of Sigmar, and a lot of people hold that against them. Since then, in 9th edition, they had the Infernal Master as a new Sorcerer variant, and in 10th edition we had the Sekitar robots. Quite a fun idea with the Egyptian statue robot things. The reception of them was a bit mid, probably still more interesting for their lineup overall than a single character release though. With their main release wave in 7th edition, I'd be kind of surprised if they have any sort of major focus when it comes to 11th. Their kits aren't really of the age where you'd really want to be redoing things that came before. I more suspect they just get a token filler release. I guess it's not impossible. They are the Deity Legion that's gone the longest since a major release wave, and there might be some hype around Space Marine 2 that might give a little bit more motivation for Games Workshop potentially. For their wishlist, I feel like there's a few overlaps with the Death Guard potentially. Having more variants of their generic forces would make them feel just a bit more core to the whole army. Perhaps some melee rubrics with spears and shields or something, or a Havoc equivalent for them. Once again, a themed Dreadnought will be something a lot of people would enjoy. Maybe similar to the Sauron Dreadnoughts from 30k in the past. If they had to do a filler character, maybe a dedicated Terminator Sorcerer kit wouldn't be the worst one in the world. Here's an option in their codex that they are currently using the Core Codex Space Marine one for. And otherwise could do some sort of Tzeentchian style demon engines, though I guess in a way we got that in a version with the Sekitars, or potentially something more dedicated as a 40k kit for some of the ported Age of Sigmar units, though I would be kind of surprised if they decide to redo Zangor's whole scale. Feels like either a Dreadnought or more rubrics would be quite a nice way to expand for them though, as they'd feel like really quite central things for the army. Next up we've got the Emperor's Children, 40k's newest faction with their 10th edition launch wave and 7 core plastic kits. They really don't have too many other options in their codex, not too many of the generic Chaos Marine things being ported over to them, even less than their contemporaries. Again, like the World Eaters, there's some hope they might get some sort of boosted follow-up like the Sister of Battle or the Leaguers of Votann got, having a big release wave and then having a smaller one to follow the edition after. Though given it didn't happen for either Thousand Sons, World Eaters or Death Guard, it isn't really looking particularly hopeful on that front. As a result, it seems more likely that they'll get something small and kind of token as a character release. Again, like the previous two, the wish list is kind of similar. A unique Dreadnought, maybe a Sonic Dreadnought or some sort of Sonic Predator style tank. Unique Terminators would definitely be up there, maybe a version of the Phoenix Terminators from Horus Heresy, but redone or debauched 40k style. Once again, you could have some more specific Slaneshi themed demon engines. I believe they had this Subjugator thing at epic scale, and then maybe a choice that might not be in quite so much demand or urgency, but is kind of expected given the other ones all got it, would be some sort of a unique raised cultist. I'm not entirely sure. I'd like to think about what form they'd take for the Emperor's Children, but some equivalent of Poxwalkers, Zangors, or Jackals. Finally, could do some Emperor's Children bikers, or even a return of the Doom Rider style miniature. Again, feels like that'd be a little bit peripheral, and probably a long way down the line if it ever happens. Next up for the Chaos Knights, we've already covered a few possibilities for them back with their Imperial cousins. They're a range that's sort of grown out of the Imperial Knight one, using the same core kits as them, but then getting some unique ones of their own. In 8th edition, they had their first plastic Chaos Knight. It got expanded to the Abominant in 9th edition, and they gave them a War Dog kit at that same time. And in 10th edition, they just had a few more weapons in the box with the Ruinator sprue. They've also been able to use the Cerastus Knights in plastic, like the Lancer. Like the Imperials, again I'd say it's been more likely for them to get about one new thing per edition, though it could be a major or minor one. Feels like they might have pushed the upgrade sprue thing about as far as it can go without splitting the core kit in two, so maybe there might be at least some hope they might get some sort of entirely new kit now. I talked about the other two lore-named classes for the Imperials, though I feel like if they did materialise, there'd be a pretty reasonable chance the Chaos Knights will get their own equivalent of them, at least if they're generic ones that might have been expected to also fall into Chaos hands. Otherwise, like the Imperials, they could also have some men-at-arms foot troops, and from the artwork there's maybe a picture of what they could look like. Some rather sinister blokes with interesting techie helms and big spiky shields here. They feel like they could be good bannermen to hold some objectives while the Dread Nobles go charging in. Then for other possibilities, they could have a named character knight, if you're going to have them try and match the Loyalist one for one, an equivalent of Canis Rex as some sort of twisted Dread Noble. At some point maybe they could get around to doing a dedicated Knight Tyrant kit with a few more obvious spikes and warp mutations, and if they did so maybe it could have some different war gear options to the Loyalist one, though it seems like that'd be really quite a big effort for a kit that's already kind of basically functional, to the point where I wonder if Games Workshop would ever bother to do that. They'd also get some benefits from the continued Imperial Armour Nightly refresh as well, being able to field new plastic versions of those if they don't get sent to Legends. I'm not too sure what will emerge from them. I think just about anything a bit more expansive and adding in a new plastic box set would be a bit more interesting than just adding in more upgrade sprues though. Finally, for the ranks of Chaos, we have the Daemons, who once again are in a fairly unusual place in Warhammer 40k, in recent times having the vast majority of their releases broadly more aimed at Age of Sigmar versus 40k, and then Games Workshop choosing not to give them a codex in 10th edition. Games Workshop gave all the major deities at least one big release wave in fairly recent times. Tzeentch and a Bloodthirster turned up in 7th edition, and Nurgle, Slaanesh and some more Khorne in 8th, and then things have been a bit more few and far between in 9th and 10th. In 9th we've got Be'lakor and a Demon Prince, and 10th not so much at all. The majority of their units are aimed at their sort of deity Sigmar forces, so things like the Head Knights of Slaanesh and their equivalents, which maybe doesn't exactly feel great for 40k being at the first and foremost thought of releasing demons. And certainly with no codex being released in 10th edition, they do feel like an afterthought. At the moment it basically remains to be seen how Games Workshop choose to treat Chaos Demons when their next update comes around. It just feels kind of unlikely they go straight back to having a codex in 11th after they've chosen to not do one for 10th. I have seen a few Demons units added into the Deity Chaos ones, so maybe they're aiming to make them a bit more like the Age of Sigmar ones with a mixed force. At this point it's really not too clear. If that does happen, it's maybe not super clear what might happen to Be'lakor though. Maybe he'd go to hang out in Codex Chaos Space Marines like Vashtor, or survive with his own digital rule set in some weird way. That's definitely not guaranteed to happen, but just a lot of question marks given that they didn't decide to give them a codex. For their actual model range though, they seem to have a lot of units that are kind of half out the door, retired resin miniatures that haven't been given an update, that are likely to have their rules sent the way of Legends at the next major update as a result. Things like the Blue Scribes, Epidemius, the Transweaver, Herald on Juggernaut and the Fluxmaster. Furies of Chaos were in the codex at one point, but then got taken away. Maybe a little frustrating, as he could just release the Warcry style ones for Warhammer 40k if he wanted to. And then beyond that, certain models in the faction are showing their age. You could maybe do some redos of some of the lesser demons, like perhaps the Demonettes or the Pink Horrors perhaps. There are a few more older kits in their range as well, from around the sort of 5th edition release frame. And the Soul Grinder was also voted particularly low in terms of model looks when I did a big poll for them. This guy got sent to the Legends rules for Age of Sigmar, which again might not be a great signal for his continued survival, even if he does feel a lot more of a 40k thing. There's certainly a whole bunch of things that you can do for them. I'm sure you'll be able to fill the most iconic stuff like the Greater Demons and most of the stuff in between in Warhammer 40k. They're just too big and cool to take out of the setting, though whether they're able to be fielded as one army or in deity books remains to be seen at this point. If they don't have a regular codex release though, there's far less guarantee they're going to get an updated miniature or two in any one edition. Moving on from Chaos, and now we have the Xenos, firstly starting with the Aeldari, who have done rather well for model updates over the past 2 editions. They did have an absolutely vast range of models that were in desperate need of an update, but Games Workshop seems to have got through the vast majority of them now. 9th edition had a pretty enormous release wave with the Avatar of Cain at its helm, and then 10th edition filled in lots of the gaps with that. Lots of Phoenix Lords and Aspect Warriors getting cool new kits. It was really nice to see them redone and done well. After those two big enormous release waves, I'd just be very surprised if Aeldari themselves get a major one for 11th edition. It just feels unlikely they'd get quite such a big one 3 editions in a row. Though not impossible they could have some attention paid to their sub-ranges or have some kill team expansions. If they did get a single character release or something in an end edition campaign, Karandras and Prince Iriel particularly stand out as being major characters that had their Finecast models go away. For Karandras in particular, there's about zero chance they didn't do a new sculpt of him alongside the Phoenix Lords and Aspect Warriors. They've just chosen not to release him for 10th edition. For Iriel, he's certainly one of the big names of the Eldar, and again seems perfect for a single model release if they wanted to do one. Like several of 40k's more established factions, the Aeldari have seen a vast amount of things come and go over the years. As a result, there's a lot of inspiration that they could draw on. For other character miniatures, it'd be nice to have an Autocon Jetbike back. They could bring back the Bone Singer from Dawn of War. They could do the Shining Spear Phoenix Lord, who's supposedly out there. There's a few named characters, including a Spirit Seer, and a couple of Ranger characters that they could release or re-release if they wanted to. For the age of kits, the Falcon, Viper, and the Wave Serpent are all particularly old compared with the rest of the range. I still feel like they hold up at least nicely enough, but I feel like people wouldn't be too against them having an update. Or you could dig into their Forge World back catalogue of things that got removed. Things like the Hornets were quite popular, or bring back the Shadow Spectres if you want another aspect. Then with a whole bunch of big themes in the army, there's a lot of sub-ranges that you could dig into. Harlequins could get some more love, maybe doing an avatar of Segarak or similar. I feel like Eldar Exodites would be a cool expansion, maybe as a kill team or something, or some sort of Dino Rider style unit. They could further expand and deepen the Inari lore, though they do seem to have sidelined them. Even if it was maybe just one themed infantry kit to their faction, it could expand them a bit. And then, as seems to have been rumoured recently, you could expand the Aeldari Corsairs into a mini-faction. They had some Forge World rules in the past. I believe that there's been some talk of a mini-range for them from Chapter Master Valrak and others out there. And a rumour engine for something that looks Aeldari that Games Workshop shared on the top right. It's a sort of tassel thing with some appearance similar to the Corsairs. Sounds like, given some rumours, that might be the biggest chance that Eldar gets another major release, given just how much they've got recently though. For the other side of the Space Elf coin, the Drukhari are more desperately in need of a release wave. They've really had quite little in recent times. In 8th edition they had Drazar and the Incubi, in 9th edition Leader Hesperax, and then in 10th they've had the Archon, Lady Malice and the Mandrakes. With an older range from around about the 5th edition kind of time, they seem kind of overdue for an update. I was guessing they'd probably have a major release wave towards the end of 10th edition, but it didn't materialise. As a result, I feel like they're just even higher odds on for 11th now. One of their biggest issues is that there's just several classes of units sent to wait in Legends until they get a model release, including some staples that have been with the faction for a really long time, like the Grotesques and Beastmaster and Urian Rakarth. Hopefully in 11th edition they get a proper release wave to fill a bunch of those gaps. Those 3 plus the Court of the Archon seem like some of the first ones to redo. I feel like the squad options out of those could easily work quite well as kill team kits, as they did with the Mandrakes. Otherwise they do have some other character miniatures they could dig into. You could do Duke Slices or Karadurak, though like Lady Malice they maybe seem like lesser priorities than getting their Finecast things rescued. If they did a major release wave for the Drukhari, I feel like there's a good chance they'd cap it off with a centerpiece for Astrabel Vect. He's a major Warhammer 40k character, and they do quite like their big centerpiece miniatures to sell to you these days. Would be nice to have him at the centre of the range. And finally they could resurrect some of the Forge World kits. There are some other variants out there of skimmers like the Reaper or the Tantalus. You definitely could have some different variants to go alongside the established Raiders, Venoms and Ravagers. Fingers crossed Games Workshop show them some love though. They're perhaps one of the single most deserving factions of an update right now, maybe alongside the Grey Knights. For the Tyranids, of course in 10th edition they've had their enormous great big antagonist faction release wave after a fair few editions of very limited support. Only getting the Parasite and Mortrex between 8th and 9th edition combined. Generally the new refresh of them was really well received though, plus they got some Raveners along for the ride, though at least in recent times it doesn't look like the antagonist faction has typically got a big release wave the edition after as well. Necrons maybe got a slight bit more than usual, with 3 characters coming out with their codex in 10th, and Death Guard just got their Fortification and their Lord of Virulence miniature with their wave in 9th. Overall it seems kind of likely that they get releases at a slightly smaller scale, so I wouldn't be hugely hopeful for a major follow-up wave. I feel like the Tyranids release did do the vast majority of the important things, though there were a few things that were maybe speculated or they could have done beyond that. I believe the Carnifex is now the single oldest kit in the range, holding up well enough, though I feel like they could update if they wanted, maybe being a little bit bigger and more imposing for the central Tyranid monster. Probably more in need of an update though, the gargoyles might be one to talk about. The flying base status of their miniatures isn't particularly well enjoyed, even if I feel like the miniatures themselves aren't too bad. The other Endless Multitudes got updates, but they did not. Otherwise, they've got another couple of named organisms, with the Doom of Malantyre and the Red Terror that they could either redo or reinterpret. One release that seemed like it could have been possible was a remake of the Tyranid Shrikes that used to be from Forge World. They're basically winged warriors, and they seem like they could be a shoe-in with the winged prime that they released for them. At the moment, he's rather awkwardly having to either lead gargoyles or having to slog alongside some warriors. Warriors themselves are another one that might be of the sort of age that Games Workshop might eventually decide to do a refresh for them. Like the kind of effects could be a long way away yet though. Otherwise, a few other Forge World miniatures that they could redo, or maybe give them a proper plastic super heavy. I'd guess that if they were going to do that though, they might have made it in place of the Norn Emissary that they got in early 10th edition. That felt like the big centerpiece kit that the Tyranids are getting at this point. In general though, it feels like Games Workshop checks a lot of boxes on the update front, and the Tyranid range is in a far better place than it was before. For the Genestealer Cults, they feel like they're in a place similar to, say, the Admech and Sisters, a fairly recent range that returns to Warhammer 40k, a sort of medium-scale one when they came out in 7th edition, and then getting a fairly big follow-up one in 8th. Since then, though, it's been kind of minimal, a Reductor Saboteur for 1 Codex in 9th, a Benefactors in 10th, they did get a Brood Brother kill team, a couple of limited edition miniatures, plus they can use the new Tyranid Genestealers as well, which were redone fairly nicely. I feel like given when their faction launched, I'd be kind of surprised if we see any sort of major release wave for them anytime soon. None of their miniatures are old enough to need updating, and their range feels like a fairly nicely well-rounded insurgency, though maybe a bit heavy on the character datasheets and seemingly getting even heavier on that if they decide just to release characters each edition rather than anything else. For the Genestealers, I feel like there's more room for creativity than necessarily drawing on other things from the past. I guess maybe some sort of big drill style unit could work quite well, like a Hades breaching drill equivalent. That feels like it could work rather well with their mining aesthetic. They could maybe do an updated version of their battle limo that they had, though I'm not sure how they'd make that work in with their new mining aesthetic. It'd be quite nice if the Brood Brothers kit was actually represented by a datasheet. You can use it to field some Imperial Guard infantry units, but a lot of the upgrades don't really map on super well with them. And beyond that, you could have all sorts of combos of interesting mining gear and mutants and things. Maybe a beast handler of some sort with some devolved mutants could be fun, or perhaps some more Imperial technology, making use of some of the vehicles on Necromunda or something like the Sentinel Powerlifter. There are definitely a few choices, but maybe not as many really obvious ways to go for updating things already in the lore compared with some factions out there. Next up, we've got the Orks, and they're speculated to be the antagonist faction for 11th edition. If that does wind up being the case, then they're in for some good news. It feels like they maybe haven't done quite as bad as some over the past few editions. We had a medium release wave for 7th edition, Gasguller and 6 Buggies turn up in 8th, then a big Beast Snagger one in 9th, plus some other stuff like the Deathcopters and Commandos. And then in 10th it was a bit more muted. We got a big mech and some tank busters and breaker boys, but still that's far more releases than several factions have got in recent times. I still do feel like they could be a good fit for an 11th edition antagonist faction though. Orcs vs Marines feels like a classic matchup. And again, as a really big, well-liked and well-established faction, they're not short of inspiration for what they could do. I guess a mainstay of a refresh might be around the sort of 5th edition era kits that they've already got. Games Workshop have been slightly upscaling the Orks and have them with a bit of a different aesthetic and standing up a bit taller. So all the ones with the older style aesthetic could probably be fair game for update at this point. Things like the Warbikers, Looters and Burners, Storm Boys, maybe Gretchen, Knobs, Death Dreads from 5th edition, maybe even the Mega Knobs despite coming out a fair bit later. The Boys kit could also be another one to update. Despite getting a new one in 9th edition, Games Workshop did it rather weirdly when you can't make a full squad of either shooters or sluggers and choppers for some reason. And you could have some variant mainline boys such as Ard Boys with some heavy armour or stick bombers. There's lots of easy special characters that they could release. Captain Badruk, Mad Doc Grotznik, Boss Zagstruck, Nazdreg of the Bad Moons or Old Zogwart all had previous rules at some point or another but no longer have rules or models now. Some of them never did have miniatures. Feels like out of those, maybe Mad Doc Grotznik or Captain Badruk might be slightly more likely. Though for generic characters, feels like an Orc Weird Boy almost has to be on the cards. He's one of the very few last surviving Finecast miniatures, and as a fairly core choice for the army, seems liable for a plastic update. There's plenty more than that though. You could have removed Forge World things redone, like the Grot tanks, the boss on the Warbike, or the Chinook Warcopter. I think it would be really quite good feels to have a proper looted wagon, an Orky gun tank, as opposed to the battle wagon transport. Orks don't really have a proper dedicated Daka tank at the moment, and a looted Leman Russ is a fairly iconic thing going back to a long time. You could play them in the original Dawn of War. I'm sure you could find some more squigs for the beast snaggers to trap. Perhaps some squig herder style units would be a sort of nice middle one. And if we're going for wishlist items, it would be really cool to see a plastic squig off. Again, they feel like a pretty epic Orc kit that I'm sure a lot of people would be tempted to pick up if they came out with. Overall, feels like they're not short on options, and if they wind up being the main title faction of 11th, then they're almost certainly in for quite a good time. I certainly expect a good chunk of models to be updated, likely some entirely new things thrown in along the way, probably at least some of those special characters to come back, and maybe some of the stuff on this page if we're lucky. Next up, we've got the Necrons, stars of 9th edition Warhammer 40k, having gone a few editions with limited stuff, then a pretty enormous range expansion and refresh for 9th edition, and then in 10th they still haven't done too badly. 3 characters with their 10th edition Codex launch, the Geomancer Kill Team, and a Nightbringer coming soon. They are a popular faction and definitely have some chance to get a bit more love, though it looks like at least one major release is probably going to be coming out in 10th edition rather than 11th. It will be nice for people to have the chance to pick up the new Nightbringer though. His model was particularly well received. I think people were looking forward to it ever since they saw the rather spectacular Void Dragon when it came out. I guess it'll be somewhere early-ish in 2026, maybe associated with their end edition campaign, and could be around March or April time if I had to guess. Beyond the Nightbringer though, the Necrons do have a couple of super obvious things that seem guaranteed to get an update, and it's just a question of when. The current remaining Finecast miniatures are super obvious. The Deceiver will likely get a redo like the Nightbringer and the Void Dragon. It'll just depend when they get round to it. Trazyn the Infinite's probably going to have an updated character model in the not too distant future. Zero chance they did Oricon but not Trazyn. Maybe he'll be back in an end edition campaign, or it could be a character release for 11th. And then whenever Necrons do get a medium-sized release wave, the Locust Destroyers will probably feature in it. They're the last holdout of the classic Green Rod Gauss weapons. And if they turned up, maybe there'd be a chance they get the Locust Lord updated to go with them. He currently has rules but no model. They're probably the most likely things. At some point they could redo the other retired named characters like Amrike the Traveller, Nemesor Zandrek and Vargard Oberon. There's a fair few more character ideas beyond those. You could have a flayed one Flayer King, resculpt the classic Necron Lord, or go for a leader for the Triarch Praetorians who currently can't be joined by characters. Pariahs are probably gone from Necron lore, but you could have a sort of spiritual successor to them, unless you count Lichguard as that. They do have a few Forge World things for inspiration too, the Necron Pylon being a fairly fun and iconic looking model. And they did have a few medium-sized Canoptek beasties that went off sale and could potentially have a redo in plastic. As a big popular and well-liked faction, I feel like there's at least some chance they get a bigger update than most, perhaps focused around those Locusts. For the Tau Empire, they had a major release wave in 7th edition focused around battlesuits when things like the Ghost Kill turned up, then a couple of slightly quieter editions after that, a new Shadow Sun in 8th edition, Dark Strider Farsight, and a couple of kill teams in 9th. Then in 10th edition they've had a sort of big Tau but not Tau release. Their troop mercenaries expanded into a big and nicely redone plastic range, plus the Vespid getting an update as a kill team. It seems they're not quite done with Kroot releases either. It kind of weirdly means that Tau as a faction have had plenty of model releases recently, but in terms of an actual major release around the core of the faction, they've not had that for a fair bit of time at this point, particularly for a fairly popular 40k faction that's widely collected. We do have one more release to come in 10th edition though, which are the new stealth suits. These ones did seem odds on to get redone at some stage, being one of the oldest Tau kits, and appearance wise they perhaps seem to go around about halfway between the older XV15 and the chunkier XV25 suits. I'm sure they could dream up all manner of different flavours and varieties of battlesuit, though otherwise for older models in their range, the Firesight Marksman has survived surprisingly long. Again, the Sniper Drone team being one of the very last things in Citadel Finecast resin, so maybe it survived long enough so it's going to get an update. There's some special characters they could bring back, Ornvar and Ornshi potentially, despite Ornvar being Lord Dead. Perhaps they could bring him back hologram style. Forge World had plenty of good inspiration for the Tau, a lot of it now removed. In particular, I did see a lot of people who enjoyed using their Riptide variants. That definitely feels like a kit that they could add more options to if they wanted to. Maybe it could be ripe for an upgrade sprue if they'd like to. The Hazard Suits could be a fun option for another medium-sized battlesuit force. And there's plenty of things for support elements like maybe the Tetras or those Remora drones. Otherwise, maybe thinking a bit more hopefully. I know we've had lots of Kroots, but I feel like they're kind of missing just one great big centipede monster that can deal damage to enemy heavies well. Maybe something greater Narlock style, like in Dawn of War. You could maybe have some sort of conversion kit for the 8s to go alongside Farsight. That does seem fairly unlikely though, and if they are going to do quite so many auxiliaries, they could add in another Xenos species, or even human Gavisa auxiliaries. I feel like adding in some humans fighting on behalf of the greater good would add a fair bit of interest, and definitely no reason that they couldn't have them lore-wise. It does seem that they're probably not entirely done with Kroot yet for 10th edition in any case, as we've had a couple of rumour engines that seem to be quite specific for them. Sort of a bionic fist for a Krootox rider potentially, and a Kroot style gun. Maybe put them together and you might have a named character riding a Krootox potentially. It'll be interesting to see what this one eventually turns out to be. Then finally we've got 40k Space Dwarves in the Leagues of Votann. Being a new faction, they've had major release waves both this edition and last one. Their 9th release wave was slightly bigger, then they've had the Hernkin Jaegers with a follow-up wave from 3 special characters, the Capricus and the Ironkin Steeljacks, plus their Chthonian artillery. Given 2 major release waves in a row, even for a new faction, it feels like they're probably less likely to get more stuff in 11th now. They've still not got an absolutely enormous army range though, and it still feels like there's some 40k niches they haven't hit on yet, but I'm not sure it'd hugely surprise anyone if Games Workshop didn't give them yet more stuff 3 editions in a row. With nods to most of the old squat things done in one way or another, it's probably more looking at generic 40k tropes to see what they might have next. Some sort of landspeeder equivalent did seem like a likely one to me before, and we do have the Capricus now. Maybe the other 2 that just seem like they're going to be very likely to happen at some point would be some jump infantry and perhaps a walker. I'm pretty convinced that jump infantry are going to be happening at least at some point, given that we've literally seen a Votann jump pack in their Hearthkin Kill Team box sets. So we know we have them and use the technology. Seems like a matter of time before we actually get the miniatures for them. Otherwise, the other perhaps surprising thing that the Leagues of Votann don't have yet will be some sort of walker. Could either be an exosuited one with a crewman or a big robot. Either of them feel like they'd work really quite well and would fit in with their aesthetics. Again, I would be very surprised if we don't get one in the long term, even if it's not super soon. In any case, that's just about it for this one though. Lots of possibilities for lots of factions talked about there. Let me know what hopes you'd have for 11th edition for your armies. Would you particularly like to see any of the suggestions here, or do you have any other ones of your own? As usual, I'll look forward to hearing all the comments down below. That's about it for this one, though before I go, I'll just cycle back to Titan's Terrain, the video sponsor for those interested, and talk through their range of folding cardboard terrain. Compare with most terrain sets out there, and bear in mind that this one does have some more major advantages and disadvantages compared with the rest. It's a bit more unusual to use pop-up cardboard terrain for 40k. For the main advantages of it, it can all fold down flat in a small box as mentioned, so it's very easy to store and super easy to transport around if you're going round to a friend's house, probably more so than just about any other terrain set out there. It is cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, at least comparable to some of the cheaper MDF options out there, and it does have the advantage of not needing any painting or assembly, being ready to go basically immediately, if you do want to preserve limited hobby time for your armies. For potential downsides, it is a little bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF given it's made of cardboard. It is designed to fold flat. The grid layout can mean a bit less flexibility than some as well. It might not be the worst idea to put a bit of extra terrain in between to break up some firing lanes, but you can still get a bit of variety by rotating the tiles and putting them out in different layouts. It doesn't make tournament standard layouts or anything like that, but I've got plenty of anecdotes that it works well enough for more casual games. For their specific sets, they have a couple of different ones, a Forgotten Furnace, which is sort of a Chaos Foundry style vibe, all glowing runes and burnt out factories. And then a Shattered Hive one, which is a more standard bombed out city, lots of armoured containers and more normal looking ruined buildings. Each of those also has an expansion centerpiece set as well, a big cathedral style thing for the city or a big infernal spire for the foundry, and you basically make those by pushing 2 tiles together to make one big centerpiece. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel and keep these videos coming, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.